So let's say the nonfiction writers you see who are able to make a living as a writer. Like, how do they piece that life together typically? Obviously, it's gonna be different for everyone, but what's the big picture that you see?
So book sales rarely cut it. I mean, there are some exceptions out there. Like the big one right now would be James Clear and Atomic Habits, which
Mhm.
hasn't left the bestseller list in what, like 4 or 5 years? But that's like one book out of the millions that have been published since that initially launched. Very few are going to earn a living. Very few authors are going to earn a living from the book sales alone. Even if you get a nice advance, like even if you get a six-figure advance, that's just it'll hold you for a little while, but not indefinitely. So,
'Cause it can take years to write a book.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So there are other methods of earning money, and in fact, most people who come to this from an entrepreneurial background or from a business background, they're actually looking at the book as more of a business card anyway. It's there to support other efforts. It could be to support consulting, coaching, services, speaking, teaching, all these other revenue streams. And in fact, there was a really recent study done for business book authors specifically, but I think it applies to all nonfiction authors, showing that the books rarely give you a positive, well, I shouldn't say rarely. Um, Maybe half would give you a positive return on investment. That doesn't mean a living. But most people were earning profits off those other things that I mentioned, especially like consulting or teaching or speaking. For nonfiction experts or people who are authorities in their field, that's the much more lucrative side.
Mhm. Can you talk about, speaking for free versus speaking for money as an expert? Like,
Yeah.
do you need if you wanna build a successful writing life, do you need to do both? Do you need to do one to get started, or should you just only do things that pay? Like, how do you advise people to sort of build that part of their business life?
Well, there's so many variables here, right? So I don't want to speak for what every author might do or should do, but I would say, speaking from my own experience and other authors who are comparable to me, there's usually a mix of things. And so, in other words, there might be local or regional and even sometimes national opportunities where maybe you're going to speak for free if your expenses are covered, or maybe you're going to speak for free because the opportunity is going to give you some paid gigs as a result. Like it's going to provide you contacts or some networking that is just as valuable as that speaking fee. And then there will be other opportunities where they are going to pay you that 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 plus. Because you have a name that really means something to that event, and your name and the fact that you're showing up at that event actually helps draw attendees or helps the event itself be more desirable and profitable. So you have to take an honest look at yourself on some level and say, what am I bringing to this event? Am I worth what I'm asking for? But I will say, for novelists or memoirists or some of these other folks, I do not advocate necessarily speaking for free, but you have to consider if you're just starting out and your book isn't that well known, sometimes the visibility and the networking, meeting people who can advocate for your book is just as important as getting paid.
Right, and it all sort of builds because sometimes people write books so they can do speaking, sometimes people
Right.
end up speaking because they've written a book.
Exactly.
Um, one thing you said in your book that I thought was really wise was to focus on the message and not the container. Can you talk more about that?
Yes, I deal with many people who really glorify the book. The book at like especially I don't wanna say this is just older people, I think it's all ages, but definitely people who came of age before the internet and fell in love with books and authors or going to the library or the bookstore. They tend to put a lot of authority and weight on publishing a book, and they really want something out as a book because that like, then you've really accomplished something.
Yeah.
And, I'm not saying that's wrong, like, that whole mythology of the book still exists. But there's also so many other things out there now competing for our attention. There are so many other ways, especially on the nonfiction side, that we consume media, information, different ways we learn, different people that we respect, or teachers, the whole 9 yards. And this, I include myself in this. So most of my writing is not in book form. It Most people are learning from me through shows like this, through interviews that I give at conferences, through the classes that I teach online, through the newsletters that I send every week, through my website, through the archive of material going back to the year 2010. So people interact with me in a lot of different ways. And in fact, some of these I think are more valuable to people in that moment than actually sitting down with the book. I mean, the book, as we just discussed, it goes out of date. And I can't speak to some of the ways that the market's changing or people's own unique experiences. So I'm always counseling people to think beyond the book. There's so many ways to share a message, to be in front of an audience, to help people on the issues that you care about. A book is, and books are, it's sometimes hard to break through with the book. There aren't that many, let's say, publicity opportunities to talk about just a book. There usually has to be something else behind it, some message, some problem that you're helping people address in order to get the attention for the book itself.
Yeah. One thing I'll say though, I have subscribed to your newsletter for years, and yeah, it's so great to have it all in
Yes,
one place,
yes,
to be able to tell my younger friend, like, "This is what you need to know," like, all this here. So, it does serve a great purpose, and in some ways, it's easier to recommend
right.
instead of saying, "Well, subscribe to her newsletter, and over the next 5 years, you'll learn everything that's really important."
Yes.
You know? So I do love books for that reason, but I know what you're saying. And, another thing and one thing you said in the book that really surprised me is that, digital publishing hasn't taken over as much as people, thought it would maybe 10 years ago, which surprised me because people send me physical books because
Mhm.
they're nice to hold up in the
Yeah.
interview, and when I'm reading for pleasure, I typically read an ebook, but it sounds like maybe that's not as much the case for everyone.
That's true. So, like, when I was working in the industry in the early 2010s and the Kindle and ebooks started entering the market, especially with the introduction of the iPad and the Apple Bookstore,
Mhm.
I was one of those people who was saying, ebooks are going to be the dominant format in 5 years or 10 years, and that has not happened. I would say on average, it's about 30% of what traditional publishers sell if you average together all categories, all types of publishing. To be fair, if you just look at the self-publishing market and the authors who are very successful in genre fiction, like romance, science fiction, and fantasy, that is largely ebook driven or people reading through Kindle Unlimited. So there are like very specific sectors of the market that are dominated by digital formats. But I think one of the reasons print has had such staying power is that it's still a technology that works. There are also, I think, pricing issues that have been there from the start, where if you look at the price of a print book compared to an ebook from a traditional publisher, the ebook does not look like a good value. Sometimes it's even priced higher than the print. So that's also, I shouldn't say standing in the way, but encouraging print to remain where it is. As of today, I think it presents a break from the screen. I think it can be a luxury. It can feel like a luxury to like just have this time away from what we do maybe with most of our days, sitting in front of a laptop or a desktop computer.
Mhm.
And now we have like deluxe editions, things with the sprayed edges and like all of these things that are helping make tangible um, the authors that we love, the stories that we love. And of course, traditional publishing loves this. I mean, they're they're jumping onto that print luxury. I hesitate to call it a trend, but it's definitely ramped up in the last several years. Now, one thing that's interesting though is audiobooks, digital this is a digital format at this point. Most people are listening through places like Audible or Spotify, and in some areas, audiobooks have overtaken ebooks in consumption. And so that's a very interesting thing to watch as well. It's not something I would have predicted, but it has helped preserve young people's interest in books because of the ability to listen while they're doing other things.